Good morning, Natalia. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Hi. How are you?
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yeah, nice to finally meet you. I've heard
Nice to talk to you. Yes.
heard always good things about you and read
Thank
some of the good stuff that you published.
Thank you.
And then finally, we're able to connect.
Thanks. So, are you based in Canada or?
In Vancouver, yes.
Yes. Yeah. In UBC, right?
That's right. Yeah. Well, I have a couple of hats that I wear. One is with UBC.
Yeah.
And then the other one is with within an NGO called CASO, Canadian Executive Service Organization.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been doing some work on economic development, governance, strengthening institutional capacities. So I'm assuming that this is, so there's Jacques here.
Yeah, good morning, everyone.
Hello.
Incredible, I fixed the problem.
Oh, you're becoming tech savvy, so I'm impressed.
Yes. Okay, good morning, Natalia. Good morning, André. Soon Jamile will be here. Good morning, everyone. Deixa eu ver, apoio, suporte. Alguém aqui, a gente pode testar as apresentações? Good morning, Viviane.
Você quer que a gente compartilhe, é isso, Jacques?
Pode
Oi, bom dia. Ok.
Bom dia, tudo bem?
O senhor pode ficar à vontade, pode testar aí as apresentações.
Deixa eu ver, vou tentar
Estou colocando aqui, Jacques, deixa eu ver.
Beleza. Great.
Aparece aí?
Perfect.
Então eu vou desconectar aqui. Great.
Natalia, you want to try yours? Great. Perfect. Everything working. Good morning, Jamile. Bom dia. How are you?
Good morning. Good. How are you?
Yeah, fine. Very early in Canada, right?
Not for me. It's almost 10 a.m. here. I think it's only for André, who is in the coast.
But André is used to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, so it's already late for him.
Yeah, don't tell this to the clients and my employers. So they will start abusing about it.
Jamile, would like to try to share your presentation?
For sure.
See if everything is all right.
Yes, working.
Great. All right, let's try mine. Let's see. Can you see mine?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's everything working. Great. Just wait a little bit. Leave here in the
Did Antonio talk to you, Jacques?
Yeah, Antonio had a problem because he just realized that the final session of his Congress that Natalia participated and you as well, and realized that it's at the same time of this. So we are trying to have, he recorded, but I can't open. I need a key. So we're going to do us. And the idea here, I make an opening of 10 minutes and then everyone will be around. As Antonio is not going to participate, maybe 15 minutes or up to 20 minutes. And then if we have some questions, then we'll discuss some questions and see if the people will make question for us. And so that's the idea. As I told, so maybe we start with Natalia, following that order, Natalia, and then I'll pass the word to Andrea and Jamile. Will be all right like this? Okay.
Yeah, works for me.
Works for you. Let me see here.
And Jacques, perhaps, depending on how many people we have participating, and considering that we have extra time because of Antonio, we could potentially make a little bit more informal and inclusive. So asking people to introduce themselves, it gives us a sense of why they are attending here, and then potentially a chance to address and to provide more focus on our discussions. I leave it, up to you as the chair.
You have, I don't know about the time, because it, maybe it will be, I don't know if I have the time to make all the presentations and everything. Maybe in the while they have the questions, and then it will be easier. Then
yeah, sure.
Or, okay. Okay. People, they jump from one. Today is the last day of the conference here, and they are arriving from some other meetings. So, but I think you can start, and so good morning, everyone. This is the panel Social License to Operate and the Mine Life Cycle, a critical discussion about social impacts and community vulnerability before, during, post-mining transition. A very long title, but it's a very important issue today, social license to operate in the mining sector. I am Jacques Demajorovic. I am a professor at the graduate program in business administration at PPGA University. And I am the coordinator of the research group of social license to operate in the mining sector in CNPq since 2014. So the general idea today here in the beginning to give a very quick start about social license. First, I would like to thank deeply our speakers, international speaker, although some are Brazilians, but they live in Canada. First, Professor Natalia Yakovleva, that's a professor today with CAD University. She just moved from Newcastle University. I have to change here, Natalia, sorry. And she is now working CAD University in France. Xavier, Professor André Xavier from University of British Columbia, and Jamile Cruz, that has been working with issues that she's going to present here, very important also. and also recently in the debate of SLO about gender and diversity. So just to give a quick start of what we're talking about for people that are not, don't know a lot of social license to operate. It's a concept that arises amid the expansion of the Canadian mining industry and social conflicts associated. The first appeared for the first time in a World Bank conference in 1997, Jim Gumney, with this executive, brought this idea of the social license to operate, that basically in a simple way, it's a recognition of a new social contract that is no longer limited to companies and the government. And recognize the idea and the power of communities to influence the decision process of not only mining companies, but in this case, we're discussing mining, the mining company, because it is based on the central idea in which the community has, can give or withdraw this social license. This is not a formal license, it's important to understand. It's more used as a metaphor, but has a lot of concrete effects on mining companies. So SLO has been seen as a fundamental element of building the reputation company of companies. The basic idea here that mining operation, there is an increasing complexity in mining operations. You know more about the impacts, about the operation. At the same time, there is a greater community engagement and social mobilization. So that leads to conflicts that the traditional approach based on legal compliance is no longer enough to warrant company the license to operate. So in a very simple way to represent this is problems regarding the perception of community, regarding social environmental impacts, or distributed fairness lead to conflicts. Conflicts lead to risk to the business, and some of these risks will lead to increasing costs of the business. As I said to you, as I mentioned, it's very popular in the mining sector, but we've also been discussing SLO in several other sectors like petrochemical, wind energy, and waste facilities. As an example here, how SLO, at least in the discourse of the copper mining industry, it's considered very important. You have this report for Ernst Young of the top 10 business risks facing mining and metals. And you see that in 2018, social license to operate appears in the 7th position, but in the last 3 years in the same publication, SLO has been leading this ranking. I believe part of this, what may explain these results is also what happened the last 2-3 years in Brazil. You have the tragedy of Samarco, and 4 years later you have the tragedy of Brumadinho. So maybe that is one of the reasons the social license has been in this position for the last 3 years. Something interesting is that the academic, there is an important academic evolution, but as you can see, academic publication for a long time didn't address the debate of SLO. As I said, it was it started into the business to answer business needs, and for a long time, since 1996, you see that the production was very low in the academic world. But since 2011, and especially since 2013 and 14, there is an increasing, a very consistent increase in an SLO in the international literature. But so far, although still it's a field that for most important countries, the leaders, still Australia, Canada, USA, UK, especially Australia and Canada. And you see that countries like us, like Brazil or China, if you think in Latin America, if you think Africa, where there is an increasing very fast in mining operations, but the developing world has been contributing very little to this literature. So I think there is a field, a research field that you can here contribute, because as you know, Brazil is one of the leaders in mining operation. And of course, there is a lot of things to say about this relationship, mining and communities. Just an example how SLO has been contributing, for instance, to understand better the kinds of conflicts that mining operations are facing. You see a lot of different kind of conflicts, and you can point out here pollution, but today you're not talking about conflicts relating only to pollution, but also to distribution of benefits. It's a very important issue nowadays. Also health and safety and consultation and communication. And this is some of the examples. In fact, just to finish this brief presentation, you can see two very important perspectives in regarding the research evolution. First of all, there is in the literature a development of most robust models of measuring SLO to allow companies to mitigate and reduce local resistance. So this instrumental approach, you can say that is aligned with the very origin of SLO concept. I always remember it didn't start in the academic, in the universities, but it was a model that arose from business to business need. So the objective is to develop models that in order to legitimate and preserves reputation. Just some examples. You've been, our research group are applying some of these models here also in Brazil to trying to understand if like the effects on trust and acceptance regarding quality of relationship between mining companies or fair distribution of the income and so on. But on the other hand, and our research group, it's aligned with this second vision as well. You realize in the last 10 years, a very important growing of the critical perspective on SLO. Some of some of the issues that are being discussed in the literature is about, for instance, the ability of SLO, even being a metaphor, but as a model management model to transform project acceptance into an instrument to enhance equitable and sustainable welfare for the entire population. Something that you've been brought in the literature, that communities with high socioeconomic vulnerability and low coping capacity may generate a false acceptance, especially when the harmful consequences of the company activities are covered or disguised. You had an article about Samarco that you published in 2019, and you can see this, this very clear in the case of Samarco. There is a company that always talk about his social license to operate model, but in when you have the dam collapse, what you see behind this dam collapse was how the acceptance was built with hiding so many kind of informations, especially of the risk of the dam operation for the community. So recently, SLO management models evolved from one side perspective based on social risk for business to a broader vision of social risk for local communities. So Van Clay, that is one of the main representatives in the literature about regarding social impact, claims the need to anticipate and mitigate potential social impacts caused by a project and a critical factor to maintain SLO. From what is important is not only in what are the risks understood by the companies, but how these risks, these impacts are understood by the community perception. This is very important because, as Owen and Kemp sustain, there is a narrow understanding between how company perceives their impacts in a community and how community really effective feel these impacts. And you see also new issues that you are going to talk here today, very important in the social license to operate. Recently, these models are trying to integrate gender issues. For gender is a very important subject in mining, but very recently, only 2019, you had the first article integrated gender in these models of social license. And also in mining closure, we've been listening, and Andrea is going to talk a little bit about this. There is not only a need today for social license to operate, but there is new concepts like social license to close as well. You know that one of the biggest problems that you face in Brazil, what happened to municipality and community when operation cease. So after the operation is closed, and what you have in the municipality, most of the case in Brazil is economical decadence and economic problems, social problems increase in these local territories that are so dependent on mining operations. Well, that being said, I will stop my just a context, and then for people that are here, if you have any questions, you can make you can put in the chat as you want in English or Portuguese. How you feel? How do you feel more comfortable? And Natalia, please, thank you again for joining us. We would like to share your presentation.
Yes, thank you. So I have 15 minutes, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay. So let me start. I'm going to time myself because I often overrun. Right. Okay. Good morning, everyone over there in the Americas. My name is Natalia Yakovleva. I am a professor at Kedge Business School in Marseille. So I've moved from Newcastle University, London in the UK to France, although at the moment I am in London. So today I'm going to talk about a case of Russia and the process of, which is a new type of the mechanism between the mining industry and the local indigenous peoples of concluding impact and benefit agreements. Indigenous peoples in Russia is very interesting subject. I've been studying it for a number of years. Russia has a very specific definition of indigenous people. So not everyone who is indigenous are protected by the law. Specifically, very small indigenous nations are protected, whose total population of a nation is less than 50,000 people. So Russia is very multicultural country, and only 47 nations are considered to be these indigenous minorities, with a total population of 258,000 people. Interestingly, a lot of them, around 40, live in the North Siberian Far East. And if you can see at the map, they are spread out throughout Russia, although they're very small in population. They are in the areas specifically targeted by the minerals development for exploration and exploitation of oil, gas, metals, and minerals. In Russia, the protection of indigenous peoples is regulated at two levels. Russia is a federation, so at the national federal level, with all the laws that apply all throughout all the different regions of Russia, and regional level, when individual regions, or there are 89 subjects in Russia that can introduce regional legislation for the protection of indigenous peoples. In Russia, you might know or not, there is legislation on environmental impact assessment. There is no legislation on social impact assessment, for instance, such as in regions of Canada. And there is no specific legislation on impact and benefit agreement. And certainly there is no mention of social license to operate anywhere in the legislation in Russia. So I'm going to talk about my home region. I am from Russia myself. I come from the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia, which is the northeast of Russia, very far east. It's one of the 89 subjects of the Federation. It's very large in terms of its area, 3 million square kilometers, but not very populous. Only 1 million people live there. Importantly, we have several indigenous nations living in this area, and something about 15% of all the indigenous population in Russia reside in Yakutia. The region is very proactive in environmental protection and protection of indigenous peoples. And in 2010, they have introduced a regional legislation, which is called Ethnological Expert Review, which is a bit clunky term, but what it means, it's a specific legal procedure on par with social impact assessment, specifically designed for undertaking assessment of new industrial projects, including mining, of their impacts on the livelihood of indigenous peoples, and it contains procedures for compensation to indigenous communities. So over the years, on the basis of 20 ethnological expert reviews conducted, the compensation payments to the affected indigenous people do not exceed 1% of the project cost. And this area I'm talking about is very popular with mining industry, and they mine from diamonds, coal, oil, gas, you name it, it's all there. So I'm going to talk about a new area of development within the mining industry, which is actually had been developed in many areas around the world, but it's entering finally Russia, and it's becoming part of the business practice. So I'm going to talk about three major parties in this process: the government at the local level of the district and the regional government, three mining companies in this case that are large companies, and Alrosa and Vostok Engineering are part of the multinational companies, and indigenous people. So there are two indigenous peoples groups. One is Evenki, which is an indigenous minority protected by the law, and Saha, which are also reside in the region, but they are not protected by the law. So I'm talking about, if you can see, about an area in the very northeast of Russia, this district, which is a sort of district within the region. It's called Olenek district, which has an area roughly the size of Poland, with a very small population of 4,000 people, and 75% of that population are indigenous minorities. Their main industry is reindeer herding and fishing, and it's not considered to be very developed area in terms of income. Indigenous peoples really are very close with the using natural resources firsthand. So the quality of natural environment is very important for the livelihood and survival, cultural survival of this community. This area had been very much of interest to the mining industry, specifically diamond mining. Diamonds had been mined there for some time, but recently a company entered into this area for the exploration and development of a rare earth mineral deposit, which was discovered in the 1970s, but now of very important commercial interest because it has reserves of niobium and scandium, which is used as e-minerals for the new green economy. So in Russia, mostly the domestic Russian companies conduct operations, although companies in question are considered to be multinational because they have operations elsewhere outside of Russia, and they also raise capital in the international market. What is interesting in this new wave of industrial development in 2014-15, the local government has started contesting the fact that they have no say in decisions made by the federal departments for awarding licenses to these new projects. So they've launched a court appeal in which the court actually clarified that local government has no say or should not be consulted on decisions about the mineral resource rights. So the situation in the Russian law is such that land belongs to the Russian federal state as well as mineral resources, and it's the federal authorities who decide who and where which company goes and mines or explores for minerals without any consultation rights given to the regional government or to the local authorities. And in addition, indigenous people do not have the ownership rights or the right of veto of industrial projects on their traditional land. However, these companies that are in question are raising capital on international markets, and they are subject to ESG rankings, and they also adopt different types of commitments in terms of corporate social responsibility and sustainability, and they have entered into agreements for social economic development with the district at the sort of local government level. So this is a new type. Well, this is totally, I mean, I've been studying this region for some time and mining and community relations in Russia for some time. And for me, this is a new step in the process. In the past, some companies have been doing agreements at the regional level, and now companies are entering even at the lower level. It's more nuanced level, which is a welcome step because there are monetary commitments behind those agreements. Although the full extent of the agreements is confidential, we don't know what they're talking about. But also, obviously, going at the local level would ensure that interests of the local communities are more considered. So from what we know from the media, the agreements talk about very much about the topics that are covered in the standard impact and benefit agreements. Elsewhere, they talk about local employment, environmental protection, infrastructure, local procurement, collaboration with local government, support of youth, training, and so forth. So, and also support for the traditional economies, which is a welcome type of number of subjects. And I think, although what we don't know to which extent local community can influence the range of issues covered in these negotiations, and we assume it's the local government that is taking charge in these negotiations. And of course, there is a power disparity between large companies and the capabilities of local governments to influence this negotiation process. What is interesting is that regional government plays the role of the mediator. They are caught in the middle between the local government. They want to support the local community development, but also they obviously, due to the hierarchy in the governance, they have to follow what the central government tells them to do in terms of promoting economic growth and allowing the mining companies to go ahead. So what I wanted to talk about, yes, I want to talk about this importance of ESG rankings. So I found out the companies behind some of those projects, they are really ranked internationally by the ESG agencies, looking at the environmental, social, and governance impacts. And obviously that influences the loan criteria given to them. Both companies are projects are listed on FTSE4Good. So, which means that, I mean, although these projects are taking place in very far regions of Russia, they're very much globalized because they are serving the needs of the global markets for metals and minerals, and also financial instruments do penetrate even into the far corners of Russia. So companies also, which is interesting, they are adopting all the international CSR standards and certification. They are engaging in GRI reporting, and Alrosa, for instance, is considered to be a leader of CSR reporting in Russia. And one of those companies, Vostok Engineering, is a subsidiary of, so several steps from the Polymetal International, which is a multinational company. It's also considered to be a leader in the CSR and sustainability. So ESG rankings and listing and financial institutions, influence of financial institutions is important, as well as peer pressure, international peer pressure in terms of CSR standards. At the moment, there are a lot of hopes that the income and revenue raised from the mining industry will be used for the protection of the natural environment and support of culture, cultural development, social development, and support of indigenous traditional industries in the region. And I just wanted to point out that in this huge disparity of power between the local governments and these multinational companies which seek international funding, leadership is very much important, and we really need to support the local government leadership and indigenous leadership who have been very instrumental in developing those impact and benefit agreements. So this is this process of impact and benefit agreements is quite emblematic of the way that Russian industry is changing from the very autocratic, government-supported one-way system to a system which is a bit more inclusive of the local community concerns and interests. So I've just picked up some of those instances where recently the diamonds, usually there is a tradition, a diamond that is worth more than 50 carats, is given a name. So in the past, from 1980s, for instance, the largest diamond mined in this region was named after the 25th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And recently they are giving names more locally, giving praise to the local communities. So 2018, a diamond was named after Olenek district, this locality, municipality, and in 2021, sadly, the head of the municipality passed away, and one of those diamonds was called after him. So I just wanted to quickly say the factors contributing to social license to operate in Russia is obviously legal reform and development of more legislation for the protection of indigenous people's rights. I think, we can see that peer pressure is working, the CSR policies and all the different standards that companies are subscribing to. And I think what's important is to follow the money. And for large companies, those who seek funding on international funding markets, they do try to improve their CSR standards, but the gray area is really medium and small, maybe mining companies. Where do they go? Leadership and what is important is to improve the governance functions generally and allow for dialogue and conflict resolution between the parties that enter in such impact and benefit agreements. So that's a quick run through. I mean, I have a huge list of wishes that I want to see in terms of ensuring sustainable development in the Arctic, and that's improvement of the rights of indigenous peoples, ensuring the local participation, which is currently lacking, industrial planning, improvement of environmental monitoring, environmental governance, but further on advancing industry standards and supporting civil society and multi-stakeholder dialogue. Thank you very much. I'm a bit over the limit of 15 minutes, but that's me. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Natalia. No problem. You have time. There is no problem. Thank you very much. You're going back to the end with the questions. And now, André, thank you very much, André, for your participation as well in this early morning in Canada. That's something good about we learned in the pandemic. No, we are much more closer to each other in some way, but sometimes some of us forget timetable and invite people and forget the timetable. And I hope you can stay friends, can keep our relationship. You're going to forgive me about timetable.
No, absolutely. I'm going to set my alarm here. Jacques, it's always good to collaborate with you, and I'm very happy that this collaboration is start expanding. I've heard a lot about Natalia, and both from the materials here in Canada, but through you as well. And Jamile was somebody that I connected here in Canada, linked with our work in Brazil. So it's nice to see that this is growing, and then there's a lot of substance within the groups that you bring together. So I appreciate the chance to be here. So I'm Andre Xavier. I'm Brazilian by birth, being in Canada for 15 years almost. I am currently an honorary professor with the mining engineering department here at UBC. And then recently, I joined an NGO called CASO, Canadian Executive Service Organization, that focus on institutional capacity, local economic development and diversification, and partnership with governments in general. And the reason for me to join them is because they have an area of practice that happens to be in the mining sector. CASO works in agriculture, tourism, but a lot of these works supporting local business, for instance, happens to be in mining regions. And we have both international projects as well as domestic or Canadian projects in many of the northern part of Canada. And then many of the complexities that Natalia mentioned in her talk happens also in Canada. I want to talk about mine closure. So when we think about the whole mine life cycle, there's an area, mine closure and post-closure, that have distinct characteristics and challenges. So this is where I spent my time of my PhD researching on, and this has an important connection to the whole economic development, sustainable development, social license to operate, and social license to close, as Jacques mentioned. But before talking about that, I just want to highlight why mining is going to grow, despite the fact that there is this push and this need and this slow movement from us as a society to move away from carbon, the carbon economy. We need minerals and metals to enable that. There's a 2019 or 2020 study from the World Bank, that mentions or shows that the need for, we're going to double the consumption of raw materials. And then by 2050, we're going to, the minerals like graphite, lithium, cobalt will increase 400 to almost 500%. And the context where this is happening is most of these minerals and metals, they are located in developing countries where they don't have the policies or the governance structures, or inequalities is something pressing. So how we're going to develop all these minerals, making sure that the negative impacts of the mines are not experienced by these groups, and how can we maximize the benefits that the economic growth can bring. Again, just to give you the context, Chile, Peru, and Mexico, they hold approximately 40% of the global reserves of copper. Lithium in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, they hold together 58% of the global reserves of lithium, which is critical for electric batteries, for instance. And cobalt, 68% of the reserves are located in developing countries. As you can appreciate, this will have different layers and several types of consequences. One of them that we are noticing right now are policy changes. For instance, Canada announced earlier this year that there are 31 critical minerals that they are key to support this, transition to a greener economy. Mexico are talking about nationalization of lithium. Peru just this year, early this year, approved a law declaring lithium as a national resource. Chile is talking about changing the royalty system, specifically for copper and lithium. Mongolia is following the same path. And part of the logic is not just changing the policy for the sake of changing it, is to ensure that those countries benefit economically from those changes, or from this sector. And in that direction, you see, for instance, Argentina willing to build a lithium battery plant. So the economic benefits is very important. As we know, royalties and payment of taxes are important, but they are not sufficient. They are not enough. And the industry historically has been very proud of saying, oh, we generate jobs. And the discourse is changing a bit for, I think, a couple of reasons. One, the number of jobs or direct employment that a mine the mine sector generate is between 1% and 2% of direct jobs, and up to 16% if you consider indirect jobs. But with automation, the need or the number of jobs will likely reduce. Just as an example, the truck driver force is expected to reduce between 60 to 75%. And particularly those activities that they require lower skills or low levels of skills in education, which are often the posts occupied by local community members, because those are easier to get people trained on. So the logic of offering jobs is no longer enough. And this will certainly change how the agreements and the IBAs are negotiated. So there's an expectation that economic benefits will be going beyond employment. There is a space for it, though, because when we look a mining project or oil and gas company, between 40 and 80% of their procurement are spent into goods and services. So there's a potential for that. But the challenge that we hear over and over again, whether it's in Mongolia, Latin America, and Canada, the local community or local businesses, they're not prepared to serve, to supply to the companies on the standard that is required. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, groundwork that needs to be done for the local communities to be ready to supply to those companies. So the industry is embracing this as an opportunity because it reduces costs for them, reduce uncertainty, and obviously generate local benefits, and helps to strengthen or to maintain the social license to operate. So local procurement and local supply chains are being seen as an opportunity increasingly. And obviously these, as Natalia mentioned before, provisions in those type of contracts or agreements, they include economic benefits and employment targets or quotas. Just to illustrate and give you a sense of the complexity in the case of Canada, there are 434 mining agreements signed with Indigenous communities. And this is, all of them have economic expectations. So moving on and talking about the mine life cycle, and what I want to spend a few more minutes looking to the closure part. In a very simple way, the mine life sequence has exploration, construction, operation, closure, and post-closure. This slide I want to show just to give you a sense of, in the exploration phase, there's a very low level of employment. So it's the number of people that the sector or that activity can capture is small. And then there's a huge spike on the construction phase. In Mongolia, for instance, Oyu Tolgoi mine is a copper mine. They had, at the time of the construction, space to accommodate 10,000 people just building the mine. And often at each shift, they would have between 5,000 to 6,000 people. And this drops drastically in the operation phase to 1,000, 1,500 people as we go. And obviously, logically, when you go to the closure phase, you get less and less people employed. So what is closed? Where is mine closure then? I think and this is based on a guide here in Canada, the closure goals is to return the mine site and affected areas to viable and whatever practical, self-sustained ecosystems, or creating an environment that is self-sustained, that allows, flora and fauna and human activities to exist. The principles of the closures: physical stability, chemical stability, making sure that there's no legacy or there's no need for ongoing care and maintenance. And there's an aspect of future land use, how that property, that site will be used after the site is closed. As you can appreciate, there is an environmental focus there, which is important, necessary, required, but this is where the industry started. So back, with the environmental movement, there was this transformation, this transition, and the requirement to focus on the environment. But the important aspect of the closure that is more and more gaining attention, this is part of the work that we are doing with Jacques and others, and this is part of my PhD study, is focusing on the socioeconomic impacts of mine closure, particularly on communities. So as you can imagine, there's when a mine closes, there's job losses, reduction in economic activities, and this has implications on mental health, migration, the people that are qualified. Imagine that we have a community of 4,000 people after 10 years, 20 years of mine activities. Those individuals that are qualified, they can be employed elsewhere, but they will not be employed locally because there is no jobs. So there's a migration there, and consequently, erosion of social cohesion, impact on the quality of life and community well-being. And there's very little study, and I hope that this is where we connect with Jamile. Our conversations often go in that direction. What is the impact of closing a mine and all these impacts that I mentioned on women and children, for instance? So the right part of the slide just shows some examples and some references on those impacts. But one case in India here is just a recent news. 2 decades after the mine closed, the community is still feeling the impacts of closing the mine. I don't want to just focus on the negative, which is it's an important aspect to highlight, because this is where how we grow. But I want to close with an example, a successful example here in Canada. This is a mine, it's called Sullivan Mine in a city of Kimberley, here in the province of British Columbia. The mine was open for about 92 years. And they anticipated the closure of the mine. They started in 1991, formally creating a committee, a group that will work on the plans to close the mine. In 1994, the group created a vision or a community plan, and this was the guide, this was the compass that allowed the group to navigate through this closure transition. And then what's clear to them, or part of the strategy, was economic diversification. And in this case, they decided to focus on tourism. Some of the lessons learned from this case was having, or the approach that they used, ongoing public consultation, setting priorities in a way that was decided collectively, public-private cooperation. So that was an approach that they felt that was important. So doing PPP, or public-private partnerships, enabling institutions, so building the capacity of the local institutions is critical, community outreach, and this economic transformation. And in the case of Kimberley, they end up building a ski resort. They also built a golf course. And more recently, in 2015, in the area of the property of the mine, they established an agreement with a private company and the local utility energy company, and they provide now they provide energy, they supply energy to the city. So that's an interesting use of the site, and it's an interesting agreement that strategically both the company and the municipality can genuinely claim that they are contributing to a greener environment. So that's one interesting aspect of this, which relates to the post-closure piece. And finally, this is a model that I end up developing as part of my studies, looking to socioeconomic aspects of mine closure. So there's 10 elements, and I don't want to spend too much time, I won't spend too much time on it, but basically you need to establish a policy and a very clear programs in place. You have to be present on the ground and having the right people on the ground to do the work and to inform and to communicate, create a space for deep and meaningful participation. You gotta have your planning system in place. Social impact assessment is critical. Having a vision of how the closure process will take place, and then you need to measure. So the performance element there is you need to measure what is happening, communicate as part of the promotion, And the other 4 elements, which is often looked into more as the soft side, and sometimes depending on to who you talk to, they think this is less relevant. Perseverance, because any change we're going to require, it will have resistance, and those changes takes time. So I think the success of the Kimberley case was because they started very early. Formally, the closure committee was formed 10 years before the mine was closed, but the conversation started even before. So having the right people with the right motivation and commitment is what I referred to as passion, and the personality, which brings this element of trust, respect, empathy. That transformation that happens on the territory when the mine shuts down is profound and is generational. So if you don't have the right people, if for somebody it's just a business, closing a shop, you don't have the right ingredients to close a mine properly. So I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to continue the conversation with the group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, André, for your presentation. I just remember when we were talking about our project in Pará, and the new sites, the S11D of Vale, when we were talking about 3,000 people in the construction, considering the size of the operations here in Brazil, in the construction, you talk about between 20,000-30,000 people. And there as well, this technological process that you demonstrate, new technology. So, and after when finally the site entered in operation, there was 3,000 jobs. So between 25,000 people in the construction and people that will stay there sometime without a job, and many times. So that's a huge concern, considering especially when you have the not only the operation but closing process. Well, thank you very much. We'll discuss that later. And now I'd like to thank also and invite Jamile Cruz for her presentation. As I said in the beginning, a very, very important subject regarding gender issue. As I told you, they're starting to research nowadays and showing the first research that gender can affect trust and acceptance in the models of SLO. So Jamile, thank you very much for joining us today. Very happy to have you here as well.
Thank you. Good morning. Bom dia para todos. I'm so happy to be here. I always enjoy watching presentations from professors and academics because I feel like there's always that connection or the missing link to what organizations are actually executing and doing and what's being researched and what we could do if we actually listen to each other and connect and make things happen. So again, I'm Jamile Cruz. I run a firm called IND 101. I grew up in Brazil, but moved to Canada right after I finished engineering. And that's when my mining career started as an electrical engineer in a consulting firm. And 5 years ago, almost 6 now, I decided to focus my efforts from my strategy and consulting perspective on changing the ways we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, and proposing a new ways of understanding the strategy around including people within not only the mining business. I work in many industries, but I would say I spend 80% plus of my time with mining organizations and associations, and a lot of work between the government of Canada and the trade, because Brazil and Canada are such huge partners in the mining industry. Going back to the exercise from Jacques, I this is something that's always there, right? We look at the business priorities and it's always a conversation around risk. And I think I even thought like, what is the title for this presentation? And I always think about like, how are we managing this? It doesn't come from an inclusion perspective, it comes from a risk perspective most of the times. So when we think about SLO and the way we do it today, which it's in transition, right? Like if we look at the large corporations website, they're definitely moving to a different perspective, not completely in the action side yet, but definitely from a conceptual perspective. Everybody's talking SG, everybody's talking about new ways of looking at social. So when we look at this EY report that they publish every year, and you can find other consulting companies that publish them as well, the link between these layers of social license to operate being the top risk for the last 3 years, and then concepts around innovation, workforce, and productivity. I think most of the large mining companies right now have a innovation lab, and part of this innovation lab, the social pillar, the social elements becoming a big part of it, on inviting startups and inviting people from the community to think around different ways of doing things, right? Things that we're not being very successful presenting at the moment. So then when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion and this connection to the social and the governance piece of the ESG, we've seen the change. And I think a lot of you, Andre, Natalia, with her examples, and you, Jacques, on your intro, you already mentioned that, like we're moving towards something new, sometimes not from the place of it's the right thing to do. Sometimes it comes from the place of peer pressure, investors pressure, community pressure, and unfortunate tragedies that we've seen over and over again. The Brazilian Institute of Mining published this letter that they call it the letter of commitment before society in 2019. One of the elements, of course, was the tailing management that needed to be revised, but they also put in inclusion and diversity as one of the elements that needed to be revised to essentially review this commitment to society and how they do business. Similar to what Brazil did in 2019, MAC, which is the Mining Association of Canada, again, both sit, one in Brasilia and one in Ottawa, lobbying the government for the industry. They also recognize the need to have a bigger conversation, and they put this letter back in December 2020 around how the members need to commit to take action against discrimination, racism, and sexism. And I'm actually super excited to see at the moment, MAC is working on a new protocol for TSM. TSM is their presented way of managing the sustainability mining. It stands for Towards Sustainable Mining, and it was a protocol developed for Canada, but throughout the years, they essentially internationalized it. And Brazil in 2019, together with this letter, signed to essentially implement TSM with the mining operations in Brazil. So a new protocol that looks exactly like the other protocols that defines the minimum requirements for mining companies to actually do the basics to achieve something around sustainability, coming with a protocol beyond. They have one for indigenous communities and the relationship with indigenous communities, but now they're essentially thinking about what is it around diversity, equity, and inclusion that needs to put in, is starting to go beyond gender from the principles. So that's the conversation we're holding currently. And then when we think about everything we're discussing here, I feel like I can not mention, and it's published in English and Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese now. Sarah Kaplan is a researcher, and she leads the Gender and Economy Institute at University of Toronto. And she published this book, The 360 Corporation. The book looks pretty much into this relationship between the legal case, the business case, and the moral case, right? Going through that last slide that André showed, when we look at the variations of why we do things and how to manage this change, there is legislation, there is the impact on business from performance to productivity to the financials, but there are also the moral, right? We are understanding the social issues and social justice and the fact that we can no longer close our eyes. So I think there's like elements that are coming around to make organizations rethink the models and rethink the just for profit business model. And I think that's kind of the movement we're starting to see getting some traction. September was an interesting month for those following like the large mining organizations. So if you go into the website for Anglo American now, they are saying, okay, we might walk away from some of the indigenous lands that we're going to operate on. Plus, we're putting this social way 3.0, which is like a new way of managing kind of the social responsibility and the social performance of the organization. Similar to Vale, if you went to their website, I wish I took screenshots of every single website year over year, because the transition is quite impressive over the last few years. But when you go into social now, look at the list of things that they're treating and that they feel they need to explain what they're doing about it, right? Before you would see health and safety and maybe a little bit of note on our people. Now, there are targets set for gender, there are specific information about every single one of the indigenous communities where they're operating and what they stand with negotiations and things that has happened from a court perspective and from just a commitment perspective. So like the need for transparency and open up to the public, because if they don't, social media will do, right? So there's this push essentially to say, okay, here's what we're doing to try to address it. And there's even on Vale's website, this, to me, quite interesting way of presenting it. They call it the controversias and controversies, where they're going to each one of these items and explaining the business perspective and the perspective of community and business. So for all of you working in this scenario, I definitely say go there and read it, because I thought it was quite an interesting read. Very similar to this slide, I think Dr. Natalia said, like the factors that impact. I would say this is my version of it. Companies essentially from a diversity, equity, and inclusion are, I wouldn't say starting to understand, I would say most of the strategies and things that we're seeing starting to get traction now, they're like 2019 and up, right? So like it is a new thing, it's a new way, are things that they're like starting to really grasp kind of the complexity of making this work and making this a cultural factor in the organization. Just like we used to talk about health and safety in the past, I think that's the way we're trying to transition them to think about this. But essentially, there are multiple layers to this, right? Legislation, the cultural factor, how are we implementing new technology and really considering the exclusions that can form on the way we do things. And then the business outcomes, how do we link that to what we do and how that's going to impact the way we manage our clients, we manage our contracts. Leadership, right? Without starting from the top. And when we say leadership, people think about like participation of women, participation of people of color in different layers. It's not just that, right? It's really activating leadership for them to understand, because there are old models that no longer can be like used today, and we're still using them. Like we haven't transitioned much. So getting people to start move towards like new directions, not just on concepts, but really in action. Market pressure, I think all of you already mentioned. We're seeing a new way of like looking at investments. ESG investment is there. Of course, we hear a lot about greenwashing and diversity washing because it is the current reality, but I think there's a few companies ahead of the game showcasing new ways of doing it. And then social, which is what we're discussing here today, looking at community development and community engagement from a different perspective is key. Again, I always hit on this because I think it's quite important. It's a cultural change. As Andrea said, it's going to take a long time, but we need to start. And if companies are inactive today, they're starting to get reactive because something happens and they need to like deal with it. But then there are companies that are moving towards active, and we've done this in the past, right? Health and safety wasn't where we are today 30 years ago. So there is a way to do that cultural change that gets us somewhere. I'm not going to go too much on this, but the idea here, and that's most of the work that I do with organizations, is the idea that we value what we measure, or we measure what we value. So the idea of setting indicators, really connecting to the business and saying, here's how we're going to measure what we're doing, so we can say honestly that we've done something or that we're not doing something, and understanding the status quo is a big thing. So we see here the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index has, I think, 10 mining companies who make it to the index based on what they're doing today. BlackRock is starting to look at the ESG as well, even though I don't know if you're following the ESG executive that was hired by BlackRock, Canadian guy, left and said, everything is greenwashing, nothing is really working. So quite interesting to hear his speaking engagements and how he's positioning like his experience and how it's not working. And it's everything really at the moment more for show than for change. And then from a mining perspective, the responsible mining index, for example, I've seen organizations coming and asking for the support to figure out the strategy around diversity, equity, and inclusion because they are very low in this list, right? So things like this definitely like creates that peer pressure, the ranking where companies start, okay, I need to do something because this is no longer good. We're probably going to lose some investments on new projects that we want to do. So that perspective is also there. One example that I want to give to you on the collaboration of government, private sector associations, industry associations is the action plan we put together for Brazil. This is focused on women, women's participation in the mining industry. There was a plan published by Women in Mining Canada together with the government in Canada in 2016. And through IBRAN, which the Brazilian Institute of Mining, we brought this. My company was responsible for the adaptation for the Brazilian reality. And one very good thing about this is the engagement. I think we moved from 2019 when we started having this conversation to now we had the launch of the first report yesterday. So we launched the action plan in March 2020. We launched together with a letter asking organizations as a call to action saying, sign here, like tell us that you're actually going to implement and monitor your KPIs to tell us how you're doing so we can monitor the advancement on this maturity curve. And yesterday we published the first report, which we intend to be an annual report to say, okay, how are we doing? Which areas are not advancing? What we need to do next? Report is still only in Portuguese, but we already got support from the government of Canada to actually put it in English as well. So hopefully we'll be able to share it in English soon. And this is the organizations that decided to join and work with us on this plan. It's a voluntary movement. The letter is there, but there's really not a legal requirement to sign or a legal demand to publish your data or participate. But the companies that sign, we've seen that they're quite happy to get engaged and help us define the KPIs and really work towards development and monitoring of that information. So far within this year and a bit that we operated, we have 25 companies that signed the agreement to implement this. The plan has 8 strategies. One of these strategies, the Canadian plan had 5 strategies, most of them looking at the workforce and the change in the organization. In Brazil, we decided to add 3 strategies, with one of them being the social impact. And then the concept around the social impact was really the requirement or the idea conceptual of investing in the women in the communities and how that can create a way better social impact than just putting money in different efforts without that intention. I'm sorry, again, the report was published yesterday, so I only have the information in Portuguese. I didn't have the time to put it in English, but I wanted to put in here for you. From a social impact, we can see that concept around measuring. 81% of the companies, we had 16 large companies who participated in that first round of this survey. 81% said we definitely follow the impact that we have from a social perspective to our business. But then when we ask, okay, then show us the specific numbers on how you divide this investment and how that's impacting the community, only 33% of them actually measure that investment on that division of like, I do this from a gender perspective, I do this from hiring local services. So there is still a very large difference there into the concept of like, I commit to this and this is how I do business, to here I can show you how I do this and the impact that I'm having. So from investment in the community, only 13% of the company actually invested specific on the women in the community, and only 7% actually were able to report to us specifics on the social investment. So we can see that gap right away. I have the scanning code here. So if you want, you can pick up your phone and put on the camera mode and scan the report. This is going to take you direct to the Portuguese version of the report. So Jacques had to send to you once we have the English version so you can share with this group as well. But very excited to get here. Again, I think this is a movement towards engagement, responsibility, accountability that I'm quite excited to see. And then I just want to finish by talking. I have an indigenous person who works with me on my consulting business, and I always want to present to organizations we work with, mostly mining. She always talks about relationship building beyond achieving the social license to operate, and the need that we have to have a conversation for deeper engagement, right? I've participated on those initial days on setting up a mining company before, or a mining operation. And I remember the conversations we had with indigenous communities was pretty much like our concept towards then of this is what we're going to bring to your community was not a two-way conversation, was actually honest about, talk to us. What is it that you need? If we're going to operate here, if you're going to let us operate in your land, what is your community needing? How can we make this work for you, right? So I think the pathway of collaboration and sustainable and healthy relationships, it's really a relationship where conversations and agreements are inclusive, which is not what we have today. And another way that she talks about reconciliation model, and just for those who are not Canadian, we're having like a year of awakening, similar to the situation we had in the US last year that opened up the world for Black issues with the killing of George Floyd. This year in Canada, with the finding of the bodies of children around the residential schools. Residential schools were the model used by government and societies to essentially take the kids out of the indigenous communities and force them into the white ways of being in this world. So for them to lose their language, lose everything. And unfortunately this year, with some of the research and investment they put, they're finding hundreds of bodies of these kids around the lands of this residential school. So with that effort, essentially they declare September 30th, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. For those interested in relationships between indigenous communities, Canada has this whole model with 96 actions. So it's an action plan around truth and reconciliation, which really talks about how we're gonna get to a better place where there is a more clear inclusion of indigenous communities in Canadian society. So this is the model that Lena always talks about, that we need to start thinking about being more inquisitive. So open up, listen, have that moment of introspection to really accept what was said and understand how that impacts what you're proposing. Be inclusive, right? We had the launch session on Expo Zibran yesterday for this report that I just showed you. And someone, I think it was Anna from Kinross, said, like, everybody keeps asking like how we're going to make a culture of inclusion real. And we just said, like, be inclusive, right? Really stop and think about what that means to you, what that means to the actions that you have. So I think that's quite important to all of us. I'm not going to go into this because I think this is very similar to what Andrea already showed, but for a culture of inclusion to happen and for us to look at SLO in every single model that we have around social performance, we need to start thinking about things in a different way. So start with the business, really declaration of values, right? And the values can be as simple as this 4 that we have in here to say we're going to do things differently. Define behaviors for everybody in the organizations, everybody who represents the organization when talking to others in the community, and then activate leadership. We know if it doesn't start from the top, it usually doesn't get the traction we need. Create models of accountability like indicators and ways of measuring and measure that progress so we can understand where to go next, what needs to be done. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much again for having me here. Always excited to talk to all of you and excited to hear the questions.
Thank you very much, Jamile, for your presentation. I would like to, you have time now to encourage everyone that is participating to make questions. And if you feel like doing your writing in Portuguese or in English, so would be now opportunity to explore with our speakers the contents that I just will start with one question that always is in my mind for the three of you, as people will make their questions. And thinking, I always, as I make in my presentation, we're very concerned about the aspect of vulnerability, how you transform things that we are listening in effective in the context of in vulnerable context. So I had a question for Natalia about ESG, if what you've been following in a context like Russia that you explained in your research. I was concerned about how fashionable the mining or the chemical are always looking for fashionable concepts all the time, talking about responsibility. I was talking yesterday in Exposibran as well, and you listen all the time to nowadays about the power of ESG. So my question is if you do believe this ESG will make a difference in context of vulnerability, or will make this difference more in the context of the developing world. For André, the same question. I know André has been a long experience in projects in Latin America, Mongolia. If you can talk about how we can overcome this challenge of mining closure, thinking about in the developed world. How are the challenges and perspectives of, we talk about effective mining closure in these contexts. And for Jamile, also, when you have the environmental legislation, for a long time, you saw a double standard. So the environmental legislation, the same company was respecting all the environmental legislation in your home country, and you saw this double standard in the operations in the developing country. So do you think that will happen also now for gender issues? You are going to observe also double standards for all the issues that you have, or you see that a difference now today that you may prevent this huge gap between developing countries and developed countries regarding this gender, sexism, and everything you said. So I don't know if we can start with Natalia.
Yes, thank you, Jacques. Right, okay. So about the ESG rankings, a lot of the ESG rankings is really, I mean, ESG and sort of green finance, sustainable finance is growing very much. Almost every major bank now has ESG analysis. They undertake ESG analysis applied to their lending criteria. And there is a proliferation of ESG analysis and agencies out there, which is a positive step on the part of the financial sector generally. In Russia, as such, ESG is a new type of financing and financial analysis. So it is developing. To which extent Russian ESG analysts are connected to the international is something to be examined further. What my doubts are, obviously, is about setting those standards at the international levels for the ESG analysis, and international agencies rely on the secondary data and perhaps experts in their assessment, and the extent to which these ESG assessments take stock or reflect on the local realities or local impacts or local vulnerabilities. I'm doubtful of that. So obviously when agencies rely on secondary data such as CSR reports, and you can make them as glossy as possible. How do you equate them to the local realities is obviously, it's a big, it's a big question. So overall, I would say ESG agencies should be taking stock of the regional or national context. And of course, the Russian context is very specific. You can assess that like there is lack of safeguarding of local participation because it doesn't exist in legislation. And I think it should be reflected in the ESG analysis. You cannot put the company on top of the ESG, lacking any ESG links when you see that the context lends itself to certain power discrepancies between the local communities, for instance, or the lack of access to the justice tools on the part of local communities. So I want to question how effective those ESG rankings are of the local realities. And of course, ESG rankings apply to companies, not to specific projects, but and they rely on the secondary data, and they are set up somewhere at the very global international stages, right? And here we are in those circumstances where globally we are seeking these e-minerals, and again we are perpetuating those types of potentially conflicts, right? Situations where mining is entering in the lands of indigenous people. Are we making new moves? Are we improving their lives by taking or depriving them of certain natural resources or lands in the pursuit of the global green economy? Right, so that's a paradox, obviously, right? So that's something that we need to work on in the future. Thank you.
I think I'll go next if you don't. Okay, so if I recall your question correctly, is how to implement a successful or effective mine closure in developing world or in developing contexts. It's always a complex challenge because there are multiple actors there, and they have different time horizons and different expectations and different knowledge and power. There's a power asymmetry there which is huge. So mining company, they understand what they're talking about in terms of technical issues. They know what the water quality is. They know what decommissioning a plant is. But how do you explain this to a community member? How do you translate this to a municipality with 4,000 people? This is the case of a company in Peru that they are closing the mine that was open for 20 years now. So the asymmetry of power and knowledge is one that needs to be addressed. And then I argue that this is beneficial to all and beneficial to the company, because the company know what the territory, what the site will look like, what the transition is going, at least on the site. So that's saying that we don't know what we don't know. So the government doesn't know what questions to ask because they don't know what the issue is. The same thing for communities. So this building capacity at day one, in terms of what is a mine, what is the mine life cycle, what are the issues required. So if you do that throughout the time, your level, you raise the level of awareness of everybody. So strengthening institutional capacities of local institutions, how the ultimate goal of closing a mine is the relinquishment, meaning if I am a mining company, now I can return the site to you, government, and the site is in the right conditions that it should be. You don't need to worry about environmental impacts. This is it. So that transfer, the relinquishment, how an agency environmental agency will be able to put a stamp saying, yes, I agree. So the site is correct. If you don't know, right? So that process of educating and raising the capacity of government is important. But obviously, mining companies, there's a bias and there's a perception of a bias. So needs to come, this is where I think there's a role for other organizations, the international organizations, NGOs that work in this space, and universities. So local and international universities have a role to play there in order to do research, to share results of research, to raise capacity, so everybody's less unprepared to deal with the challenges that will come. And then the society or the local communities, they have a huge role to play. Often, and we can see this trend, the legislations in many countries, they are opening up to say there's a need for inclusion, for consultation, from community consultation. But again, sometimes those consultations are just inviting a bunch of people, the friends of the friends, and they come and they are recorded in a minutes of a meeting saying that the society attended. And this sometimes is enough to validate a consultation process took place. So there is a role also, again, universities, this international organizations, and the mining companies to help sharing knowledge and building capacity, and then providing the leadership or enabling the opportunity for leadership to grow within the community so they can start asking questions, what I don't know, and then going after some of those answers. So it's a complex issue, but based on what I'm replying to you, you can tell that this is not something that you do in 3 years. So the mine is going to close. I'm announcing today, 3 years time you shut down the mine. So this is a 10, 15, 20-year process that needs to be carefully implemented.
That's a very important issue here in Brazil. Jamile?
Okay, so double standard. We have double standards for everything, don't we? I don't think we're seeing anything different than we've seen in the past with environmental. So if the question is really, are we going to see the same with gender or with equity, inclusion, diversity, that in some countries, companies that operate in multiple countries, they do one way in one place and another way in a place, 100%, right? We can see even the mining companies that operate in the UK, for example, they are already reporting on pay equity and kind of the baseline that's required from a government standpoint. But then you look at their report and see their operations in Canada, they don't do it, right? So they know they have the capacity to do it. They know it's the right thing to do, but they do where it's legislated, but not where it's not. So I think that's going to apply for everything we do until we really recognize the value and impact of this new way of looking at social. But yeah, the double standard, I would say, when we're talking about the culture of the organization, right? The way, like I have a very hard time walking away from the conversation around colonization and how we should operate on that model from a mining perspective, right? 70% of the gold extracted from Brazil, from what I believe, the last numbers I saw are still Canadian operations. So when we look at the boards of these organizations at this executive level, and you see like essentially no Brazilian representation, definitely not indigenous representation, even though they most operate in indigenous land. So we have so many layers when we're talking about inclusion and about what needs to happen for us to really not only have the representation, but really understand the impacts they have to this community. And when the impact is being discussed by none of the people that are being impacted, it's a real challenge to accept that that's the way to go, right? So I don't know if I respond specific to your question, Jacques, but yeah, I think we can walk away from double standard. It's everywhere.
Okay.
Oh,
all right.
Sorry, just so I can add one thing. One thing that I appreciate about Canadian government, we had a discussion on Wednesday, again, around this space around Exposé brand, and it was on the new model from Canada that's called responsible business conduct. And we had this specific conversation we had today, we had on Wednesday through the Chamber of Commerce. And I do appreciate the fact that we're looking at it from a broader perspective now. So when we talk about environmental sustainability, we're definitely adding governance and we're adding the social impact. So I don't know if it's the true impact of ESG in an active way, but we're definitely having a broader conversation. We walked away from that meeting and the person who was representing MAC, his first comment was, I can't believe now every time we show up to discuss any of these things, the conversation fully changed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I was like, this is the new world, right? We need to understand that we need representation to understand the full impact of what we're doing.
Great. I see there is a question here of Viviane. Anyone else? Maybe you could have 2 questions. Just let me know. Viviane, please.
Thank you, Jacques. First of all, I would like to thank you all for the presentation and shared knowledge. It's very important for us, and say that it's a pleasure to see you all again. My name is Viviane. I'm part of the research group in Social License to Operate and Social Impact Assessment coordinated by Professor Jacques. And maybe I could put together all the questions, Jacques, so it's faster, okay? For Natalia, I would like to know how you see this new wave of ESG in the sense that that overcomes the logic of local legal obligations and responds to the global logic of corporate responsibility that responds to the financial market. In the same way, in a way, it's a very interesting thing. But I would like to know, as you are commenting right just right now, how do you see responsibility, the corporate social responsibility? What?
There is a problem with the sound.
And what about now?
No, now it's okay.
Maybe I will ask the question again. Yes, the full question. Yes. So I would like to know what Natalia thinks about this new ESG wave as a milestone in social responsibility, or just a wave itself, a fashion that will end soon, in the sense that overcomes the local legal responsibilities and the pressure that makes the financial market makes in the companies. And Andrea, in the same line of ESG, I would like to know how do you see the incorporation of mine closure process into the demands of social responsibility? Do you think that the financial market is able to see the social responsibility so far when the mine is already closed? If they are able, and if the
Again, no problem. Viviane. Oh. So maybe Natalia, you could start answering. I think you have an idea about the question, and when she back.
Thank you. No, I am generally very supportive of ESG because it embeds and puts onus on financial markets as major investors in the commercial mineral production. So it puts at the heart of the financial sector, which perpetuates a lot of globalization processes, international business, and specifically mining. So having the ESG in the decision-making, financial decision-making, is a benefit rather than detriment. Then we are going into nuance, how to deliver this. Is it effective? Is it fair? Is it just? Is it reflective of the realities? Is it having a benefit for the environment, social issues, and the governance issues? So I think this is where we need to discuss. Does it replace the local logic of legal responsibility? No, it shouldn't. I think the legal reform should carry on, especially in the area of social protection, human rights, support of the communities where the rights are not yet legally protected. But I do question who sets the rules, right? And with what purpose, right? So ESG is usually based on very global standards. And obviously in that process of global standard setting, you might lose the sensitivity to the local issue. And then bam, the mining industry gets the big grant and starts exploring or start developing the mine, following only the requirements of the financial lender, rather than responding to the needs of the local community. So that dichotomy still needs to be, addressed somewhere there. And I don't think it's only the ESG agency that should be doing this, but I think it's a complex process where a lot of parties should be involved. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. André, I think the question, if it's right, Viviane, if financial market can see so far after the operation, they valorize. Was that this question, your question, Viviane, right? It's failing, but I believe it was. It was, all right?
Yeah, so
Yes.
That's
And
an
if
excellent.
just Viviane, if you can type your question to Jamile, maybe if you have any problem.
My connection.
Yeah.
It's an excellent question, and I think there's not only one factor influencing things. Definitely, the way that we are moving away, or at least the form, the language that we use, that we are somehow, for some people, upgrading the terminology, moving away from CSR and embracing ESG. I think it helps to give some focus, meaning CSR, we could put everything under CSR. And then with ESG, there is an expectation that, and then Jamile just alluded to that we're going to be talking about environment, social, and governance. So I think it gives a level of focus there. And then on the social, you're going to be talking about human rights, access to resources, to water resources, for instance. So I think it gives a more, as if we were turning, putting a spotlight or putting more light on one aspect of this whole complex issue. So I think the transition is not going to be overnight. I had a conversation with the Mining Association, representatives of the Mining Association of Canada in the past, and this mine closure is an aspect of their program, but there is room to grow in terms of how this is articulated. In 2016, I think, Brazil, a professor from USP and IBRAM, they published the guide for mine closure in Brazil, also making reference to the social aspect of mine closure, but not in details, right? So I think that the fundamentals are there, the level of knowledge and depth will evolve. And then I think as we start more and more connecting the dots, this will become more apparent and required. But I'm not sure if it will happen on the time that we need. Just to give an example, in 2018, the president of ICMM, International Council of Mining and Metals, announced at the time of the study that they have done, there were 80 mines to close in the next 10 years. So can you imagine the level of impact that this will have? In fact, this is not formally announced by Vale, but there is an article, a few years back, saying that Itabira is going to close, and we know that eventually mines will close. So imagine the impact of closing Itabira. imagine the contribution that the CEFEM, which is the royalty that goes to the municipality. So more and more, I think the social is gaining attention, but not at the speed that we need to anticipate and avoid the socio-economic impacts that it brings.
Right. I think Viviane was got in a trap again. People, you have one more question? I don't know if Jamile, if you didn't have the question, but if you'd like to make a comment.
I was just going to say that there is a podcast that I heard last week. It's from March, I believe, and it was essentially going back to your question and related to some of the comments made by Natalia and André. Was Mamilos. I don't know how many of you listen to Mamilos, but they brought a few specialists on ESG, and they're reviewing kind of the new ways that Brazil is taking in consideration some of these new elements, including conversations like Pará and the taxes that the government gets from an operation like Vale that employs a certain number of people versus the acai industry, for example. So when we look at the social impact and community, our value thing, it's also kind of not quite at the same level, right? So we need to look at kind of what impacts 300,000 people versus what impacts 3 to 30,000 in different ways, and how that's actually being implemented on different jurisdictions and everything. So it, unfortunately, Natalia, it's in Portuguese, but quite an interesting way and challenge there to us as a society to really put the pressure on government and everybody else and study new ways of looking at how we value different business models.
All right. It's here now. I think you comment a little bit on this. You want to make a last comment?
Sure. I think you heard me saying there at the beginning, it is addressed from the risk perspective is still, Viviane. I don't think when we think about new models of doing business, right? When we think about innovation, unfortunately, I feel like the constraints from old structures and traditional models leaving every single way we do, even when we do design thinking sessions with organizations and bring like new thinking to the room, we're still go back to constraints that we have from models today. So when we're looking at greenwashing, gender washing, and how does that actually impact the risk to the business, I would like to get companies to start thinking from a different perspective and really look into the benefits that's going to bring to the business and start from there and then move towards risk, right? Because the way we're starting today, essentially, it's not that it stops our progress, but essentially it doesn't enable us to move as fast as we could into making real change. But in a short answer, it should decrease risk to the business, right?
Okay. I see here it's after 12:30. I'd like to thank all the speakers for the generosity to be here, and thank for the brilliant presentations. For people, also thank people that are attending this meeting. I think what we want to show in this panel, there is still a huge way, a long way to integrate social aspects in the mining sector. I mean, beyond the sustainability divisions or managers, or what I've been seeing in my relationship with the mining sector. You already have space to talk about this and understand the social aspects of mining operations, but you still have a huge challenge in go beyond to the operation level. And I think this is the next step. And also you have a huge field of research in Brazil in this aspect. So they encourage people to get interested in not only social license to operate, but all the agreements, the gender issues, the mine closure. And thank you very much. I wish everybody very good lunch at home, at work, and hope to see you soon in other meetings. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Jamile, and thank you all.